Hey folks, it's Dr. Sparkle here. If you guys could sit down for just a moment, it's time we have this little talk. Things are changing for Chronsega starting this episode. Now things were changing for Sega in 1989 as well, and it's time we change too. Namely, it was at this point that Sega moved its focus from the 8-bit Master System to the next generation console, the 16-bit Mega Drive. Last episode we saw the final Japanese Master System game, Bomber Raid. Sega would continue to release games in the US for about another year, and for a few more years in Europe. Oddly, the Master System found its greatest success in Europe around 92 and 93, by riding the coattails of the Mega Drive success. But even after this, the system simply refused to die. The mighty Master System kept going and releasing games until 1998 in Brazil. The same year that Sega discontinued the Mega Drive and the Saturn in the US to make way for the new Dreamcast. That would be like Nintendo killing off the Nintendo Entertainment System right before the GameCube came out. So starting now, each Chronsega will have two sections, one for the Mega Drive and one for the Master System. Episode 8 will cover the Mega Drive up to June 1989 and the mid-1989 releases for the Master System. Before we get started, let's take a look at Sega's new system. By the late 1980s, it's clear that the lifespan of 8-bit consoles was limited. The PC Engine was a quasi-16-bit console and was released in Japan in 1987 and was pretty successful. By this point, Sega was already working on the so-called Sega Mark V, based somewhat on Sega's 16-bit arcade board, the System 16, which debuted in 1986. Games like Shinobi and Phantasy Zone were on the System 16 board. Both the System 16 and the Mega Drive used a Motorola 68000 and a Zilog Z80 and a Yamaha sound chip. Still, by the time the Mega Drive came out, the System 16 was far from cutting edge compared to Sega's new boards like the Sega X, used for stuff like Afterburner and Thunderblade. Still, the Mega Drive did blow away both the Famicom and the Master System in terms of technical specs. So let's do a bit of comparison here. The Mega Drive 68000 ran at 6.67 MHz, whereas the Master System's Z80 ran at 3.57 MHz. Now the Famicom had an old chip, a puny 6502, which ran at 1.79 MHz. The PC Engine used a special chip based on the 6502, which could apparently run either 1.79 or 7.16 MHz. And of course it had its dual 16-bit graphical processors. In terms of onboard memory, the Mega Drive had 64K worth of work RAM and 64K of video RAM, compared to 8 and 16 for the Master System and 2K each for the Famicom. The PC Engine had 8K and 64K respectively. In terms of color, the Famicom could show a total of 53 colors, but only 25 on screen at once, whereas the Master System could use 64 colors and 32 at once. The Mega Drive upped the ante to 512 total colors, or only 64 at once, but these colors could be darkened or lightened. This still pales in comparison to Nintendo's Super Famicom, which was more or less complete when the Mega Drive was released. The PC Engine could use 512 colors total, or a pretty impressive 482 at once, blowing away the Mega Drive. The Famicom could display 64 sprites on screen, same as the Master System. The Mega Drive could show 64 to 80 depending on the resolution, and the PC Engine could do 64, though the Mega Drive and the PC Engine could use much larger sprites. The Mega Drive also had higher resolution and 2 sound chips, and could use the Z80 as a sound CPU. Once the CD add-on was released, the PC Engine had the most powerful sound capabilities. Of course, these numbers hardly tell the entire story. Many Famicom carts used chips to boost the console's abilities by adding more RAM. And later system cards for the PC CD upped the total RAM to 256 kilobytes, and the Super Graphics bumped the stats way up as well. And likewise, the Sega CD and Sega 32X added more power to the Mega Drive. But more or less, the base stats of the Mega Drive beat everything else on the market except the PC Engine in some aspects, such as color and sound. The Mega Drive was released in Japan on October 29, 1988, 6 days after the Japanese release of Super Mario Bros. 3. Go back to Nintendo 36 if you want to see what else was happening for the Famicom at the time. Other games released around that same time period were 8 Eyes and Black Bass 2. Unlike Nintendo and NEC, Sega planned to strike North America as soon as possible. Sega's founder and then Sega USA president, David Rosen, actually contacted Atari about distribution of the Mega Drive in the US. This was Jack Tramel's Atari Corp., the guy behind the Atari 7800 and the Atari ST computer, not Atari Games, who owned Tengen. According to David Sheff, the original release date was planned for January 1989. However, Sega ended up releasing the console themselves when the deal with Atari fell through, and the name was changed to the Sega Genesis and finally released in September 1989, and then in Europe a year later. For the moment though, we are still in fall 1988, and the Mega Drive has hit shelves with a mere 2 launch games. Both of them are arcade ports. Sega seems to be attempting a strategy similar to what they did with the Master System, focusing on ports of Sega's popular arcade games. And here we have the very first Mega Drive game, Space Harrier II. Notice that we have sort of a control menu here. You can do a few things like listen to the sound samples, change the difficulty settings. This is the kind of thing we'll be seeing more and more of in the 16-bit era. We'll be seeing menus get more and more elaborate. Something very important is the rapid fire. It's a good idea to turn that on. It'll make your life much less miserable while playing this game. So this is of course the Fantasyland, which sort of ties into Sega's other shooter series, Fantasy Zone. So you will of course remember the original 1985 arcade game, Space Harrier, designed by Yu Suzuki. It's debatable whether Space Harrier 2 is a real sequel. It's almost more of what we would nowadays call a remix. When Space Harrier first hit the arcades, it was one of the most technologically advanced games out there, what with all the crazy sprite scaling. Certainly far beyond what any console could do at the time. We saw the port to the Master System in an earlier episode of Chronsega. As you might recall, it was, technologically impressive for a Master System game, but the game itself was a bit of a mess. There was lots of flicker, not a whole lot of animation. As objects came closer towards you, the way they grew in size didn't really look that smooth. Now obviously this Mega Drive version looks much, much better. It's not quite as good looking as the arcade game, but compared to the Master System, it looks much cleaner, much more solid, the animation is much better. Now technically, just like the Master System, the Mega Drive cannot actually handle sprite scaling by the hardware. The arcade games had this built in somehow. The Mega Drive had to simulate this by using sprites of different sizes. Now this guy is obviously a callback to the first boss in the original Space Harrier game. He's not a real boss here, he's more like the sub-boss. In fact, you don't even have to kill him. If you don't kill him quick enough, he'll just run away. It looks like they used about 5 or 6 different size sprites for his head, for example, so there's quite a bit of variation in size as he moves back and forth across the screen, so it gives much more of like a feeling of the 3D than the Master System version did, which I think used like maybe 3 different sprites. So here is the first real boss. The game always lets you know when a boss is going to appear by throwing in some dramatic lightning flashes. And this guy turns out to be a giant flying turtle with 3 heads. In real life, turtles are not very mobile, so I don't know why they picked a turtle for a boss that flies around real fast, but you just shoot out the heads one by one. Pretty simple. And then from here you move right on to the next level. It's kind of a shame, they put a lot of work into the enemy sprites, but they move around so fast it's really hard to see them. The only time you can really appreciate them is when you die and everything sort of freezes for a moment, then you actually get a good view of the enemies. Here's the second boss here. You have to shoot out all those things flying around him. This guy's actually kind of creepy looking, especially as he gets closer to you. Nowadays when we think of Sega, we often think of stuff like Sonic the Hedgehog and, that sort of thing, but at this time they were mostly known for their arcade games, which were like these loud, flashy, fast-paced action games that came in these really fancy cabinets. So it's not surprising that the first few games for the Mega Drive would be ports of their sort of high-end arcade games, because that's what people mostly thought of when they thought of Sega back in the 80s. But as we've seen over and over again, these games were designed to be quarter munchers, and that doesn't really translate well into a good console experience. And while this version of Space Harrier II is fun to play and it's very cool looking, it is pretty repetitive. I mean, you're sort of shooting things over and over again. We've moved into a sci-fi themed level, got these robots and these futuristic looking buildings in the background. Nothing is really too detailed in the background, like these things are passing. I'm not sure if they're like buildings or what exactly they're even supposed to be. Now here's something a little different. Space Harrier 2 has bonus levels. Suddenly you jump on this little sled thing, and while you're riding it, you're completely invincible, which raises the question, why doesn't he drive this thing around in the entire game? The object here is simply to rack up points and collect extra lives, and you'll need the extra lives because the game does get pretty hard, especially towards the end. Now I like this boss. He's like a giant flying tiger or something like that, and there's a secret to killing him. At first you need to aim for the wings. Once you shoot the wings off, they'll hit the ground, and they'll start running back and forth across the screen and then occasionally charging you. Space Harrier 2 has 12 levels altogether. It's not really a long game. And just like a lot of early console games, it almost seems sort of half game, half tech demo, kind of like something like F-Zero on the Super Nintendo. But really this is a sort of thing we're going to be seeing early on in the Mega Drive's lifespan. Eventually, of course, they would kind of move on to other types of games like Sonic, but for right now the Mega Drive seemed to specialize in these sort of fast-paced, but rather simple action games. It's odd just how tinny the music sounds for this game as compared to Space Harrier 2, which had sort of that big booming sound to it. It's also a pretty ugly title screen. The image was ripped off from the 1983 movie Blue Thunder, which was also about a helicopter. I call this the Apocalypse Now font. Super Thunderblade is of course the other launch title for the Mega Drive in Japan, and just like Space Harrier 2, it is sort of an enhanced version of a Sega arcade game, another one of those superscalar games. There's a nice little menu in this game. You can control some of the options, such as, the game's controls. There's normal and reverse. Normal is where you control like you were holding an actual flight joystick, as in the arcade version. Reverse is when you use the D-pad, and when you press up, for example, your helicopter moves up, press down, it moves down, and so on. Trying to use the normal control scheme can be a bit awkward if you're playing it with a regular gamepad. We've got a cool little animated intro here, although I don't know why you'd want to keep your helicopter in some sort of underground passage like this, where you have to fly through a narrow passage in order to get it out. It seems a little bit dangerous to me. So a couple things I'll get off my chest. First of all, I really hate this game. Well, I don't exactly hate it, but I sort of dislike it. It's not really a whole lot of fun to play. First of all, the main issue is comparing this to the arcade game. The arcade Thunderblade was one of those big, loud, flashy games. It was all about sensory overload as opposed to sort of playing a game. You sat down, put a quarter in, played for 5 minutes, and you saw all kinds of cool explosions and rock and music. That doesn't really translate to the home version. The arcade version used multiple sprites for each of the buildings to create this really impressive looking 3D effect. The Mega Drive, of course, couldn't actually handle sprite scaling internally, so they used just one layer for the buildings, making them look extremely flat and wafer-like. The gameplay is quite similar to that in Space Harrier. You sort of move around constantly trying to avoid enemy fire and try to shoot things that come at you. As has been pointed out, you can avoid almost all enemy fire simply by parking yourself in one of the corners and shooting constantly, but of course that destroys the whole point of the game. So Sega decided to call this Super Thunderblade, but it's really a slightly altered version of the arcade game. It's definitely not a new sequel or anything like that. I believe they actually did take a few things out. There's a few things missing that were in the arcade version. Of course, it's pretty super when compared to the Master System Thunderblade. As you might remember when we covered that game, they didn't even try to recreate the 3D effects, and simply they turned it down to like a top-down shooter. This is the first boss, a giant tank. Much like Space Harrier, the game is pretty repetitive, though they did throw a little bit of variety in, which is from time to time you'll have these top-down levels, which don't really function exactly like a regular vertical shoot-'em-up because you're actually shooting things mostly on the ground. What's weird here is you transition directly from the city scenes into a level that takes place above an ocean. Despite the fact that you can clearly see buildings in the background, suddenly they disappear and you're above water. These segments are a little weird because you can't actually move up and down along the screen, you can only move left to right. And the way things shoot at you from, the ground, it's often difficult to tell if they're going to hit you or not, or if your fire is going to hit them. So once you fly over the aircraft carrier, it suddenly blows up. You get a little screen that rewards you some points, and then you're on to the next level, which is once again a 3D level. So this is a part where I really start hating this game. You have to fly between these buttes, and it's virtually impossible to get yourself lined up so that you pass through safely. It seems like you're getting closer and closer, you're trying to maneuver, and then suddenly you hit something. And in case you're wondering, no, you cannot fly around them or over them for some reason. I'm sure with a bit of practice you could master this, but when you're first picking up the game, these sequences are very, very frustrating. So while Space Harrier 2 does a pretty good job recreating the Space Harrier arcade game, Super Thunderblade not so much, and it's definitely the inferior game of the two launch titles. Alright, it's Juoki. In modern gaming naming conventions, this would probably be called Record of the Beast King, but we know it as Altered Beast. Such a great name, and the music is so cool. In fact, the competing Genesis Chrono Gaming video series Generation 16 uses this as their main title music. So Zeus resurrects this guy because his daughter Athena has been kidnapped. I mean, really, shouldn't Athena be capable of taking care of herself? I mean, Athena is usually depicted as wearing a battle helmet and carrying a spear, and is frequently associated with warfare. Maybe Sega was confusing Athena with Zeus's other daughter, Persephone? She actually was kidnapped by Hades, king of the underworld. Anyway, we all know about Altered Beast. It was originally an arcade game from 1988. It was designed by Makoto Uchida, who's perhaps best well known for Golden Axe, and Rieko Kodama, who's known as the main creator of Phantasy Star and later games like Skies of Arcadia and Seventh Dragon. It was a pretty cool game, and perhaps Sega's first good beat-em-up. Now here's something interesting, check out the backgrounds here. Okay, now take a look at the Mega Drive version, and hey, they added parallax scrolling, holy cow! We'll actually see the whole, multiple plane scrolling quite a bit for this console. Now, probably most of you guys know about Altered Beast. We should because we actually covered it last Chronsega that is, in the Master System version. Chronsega 7 actually covered games from early 1989, so that version came out after this version. And as you'll recall, the Master System version was pretty terrible. By comparison, the Mega Drive Altered Beast is pretty good. It's not quite pixel perfect, as they say, but compared to Thunderblade, it's pretty nice. I'd place it alongside R-Type on the PC Engine as one of the better arcade ports of this era that we've seen so far. This boss battle is really tough in the Master System version due to the really jerky controls. Here, you can easily dodge the falling demon heads because the movement is much smoother and more precise. And there's even some sort of freaky blur effect on this guy when you hit him. Altered Beast is a mere 5 levels. Each has the same layout. You need to kill 3 silver wolves in order to fully power up into beast form. At that point, you're allowed to fight the boss, Neph, who transforms into a different form of monster each level. In level 2, you turn into dragon form. I'd like to point out one of the enemies that you see here turns up in Golden Axe as well. Those weird looking bird things with the tails you can ride in Golden Axe. The US manual for Altered Beast calls them chicken stingers. Now, when you turn into your fully powered up Altered Beast form, you become more powerful. Your beast form has special attacks. The dragon can employ some kind of lightning aura attack. You can use this to kill the boss very easily. Let's take a look. Yeah, it really is that easy. The third level takes you deeper into the underworld, and you transform into a bear. The funny thing here is the bear assumes this goofy kung fu stance while standing still. And he has a bad breath attack and a pretty cool spinning attack. And once again, there is a super cheap method of killing this boss. You just sort of jump on him and start doing your spinning attack. You don't even take too much damage here. You think you only take about 1 bar off your life meter. As far as I know, there isn't any way to refill your health meter. I mean, you do start out with a couple lives, and you can actually find extra lives, but you need to be pretty cautious and conserve your health if you want to finish the game. The fourth game takes place in Dis, the city in hell from Dante's Inferno, though it's also an old name for the Roman god of the underworld, aka Pluto. Now here you turn into a tiger, who has a pretty cool and powerful attack where you fly up and then down, destroying everything that you hit along the way. Now this boss is one of the trickier ones, the first boss that you can't easily kill using some kind of exploit. At least I don't know of an exploit for this boss. Anyway, the final boss is Neph himself, and again he can be really easy if you sort of cheat. Here I've turned into the Golden Wolf, in theory the most powerful form. Now the real method for defeating him involves jumping over him whenever he charges you, but actually you can just get on all fours and just attack like crazy. His punches are too high to hit you. I only lost about 1 life bar doing this, though of course I was playing this on the normal difficulty, not the hard difficulty. Okay, so once you've taken care of Neph, this bird appears and transforms into the girl, or I guess rather the goddess Athena. It's not really clear whether you win Athena at the end of the game, but there is a little scene of her sort of hugging him when he's still in wolf form, which is kind of weird. Doesn't really tell you if you ever transform back into your human form, or since you're dead if you just die after Zeus unresurrects you. Something else that's kind of strange is that Zeus and Athena are the Greek names for these particular gods, but the manual claims that you are a resurrected Roman centurion, so they seem to have gotten their ancient cultures mixed up. Something else that's pretty funny is that as the credits roll, you can actually attack the names in the credits as they come down. Now as far as I know, Altered Beast was a pretty big hit in the arcades. I remember seeing it all the time back then. Big enough that when the Genesis was released in the US, Altered Beast was picked as the pack-in game. So it's the most well-known of all the early Genesis titles, other than maybe Phantasy Star II nowadays. And sure, Altered Beast is not a fantastic game, but just like Space Harrier II and Thunderblade, it shows off what the system could do, and declares its blatant technological superiority over Nintendo's Famicom. It's the fourth and last Mega Drive game of 1988. We've had Space Harrier, Thunderblade, Altered Beast, and now Osomatsu-kun, Haka Mecha Gakijo, sort of the odd man out. Okay, what is this? Well, in our minds we tend to think of the Genesis as being less burdened with tons and tons of horrible licensed games based on anime and whatnot compared to the Famicom, but now we have this. Osomatsu-kun was at first a 1960s manga in Shonen Jump. It was by one Fujio Akatsuka, who also did the comic Tensai Bakaban. We saw a game based on Tensai Bakaban for the Sega Master System a couple episodes back. Now, there was an animated version of Osomatsu-kun in the 60s, but then a new animated series was running when this game came out, so that must be the one the game is based on. It was produced by Studio Pierrot, who Sega seemed to have some kind of relationship with. They also did the Anamitsu Hime cartoon that received a Sega Master System game, which was released in the US as Alex Kidd in High Tech World, and they were even involved with the Sonic the Hedgehog movie from the 1990s. The Mega Drive was capable of multiplane scrolling, 3 layers I believe. As we see here, Sega's programmers jumped on that. It was sort of an obvious graphical signature that distinguished the Mega Drive from its competitors, so it was sort of like the Mode 7 of the Mega Drive. It was used quite a bit. Now you play as Osomatsu, who is one of 6 brothers. Actually, the brothers are identical sextuplets. Now in the real world, this would have been quite extraordinary, since there are no records of identical sextuplets ever being born. In fact, when the manga first appeared, there were no documented cases of sextuplets having survived infancy. Hell, the Goslings became famous by having sextuplets not that long ago. The game is a bog-standard side-scrolling action game. Aside from the source material, there's really not much distinctive about it. It reminds me a lot of Keith Courage for the PC Engine. Basically, you walk forward and shoot stuff, with a bit of platforming thrown in. One thing that really bugs me is that so many enemies can't be hit while you're standing up, you actually have to duck in order to shoot them. If nothing else, the various monsters are kinda kooky looking. There's flying cats dropping bones on you. Oh, and look, here's a Kit Kat bar you can pick up. This is the first boss, not too interesting. You can pick up some power-ups to make the fights easier. That's probably a good idea for the later bosses especially, even though this guy is pretty simple. The other characters from the series make various appearances in the game. You often find mutant versions of the characters appearing as enemies. Also, there's these traditional type Japanese creatures that turn up a lot, as we've seen. I actually sort of wanted to like Osomatsu-kun. It was the first original title for the Mega Drive, first based on a licensed property, and the first side-scrolling platformer. Altered Beast is more like a beat-em-up than a platformer. But the problem is, it's just a little dull and a little lame, compared to something like, say, Super Mario Bros. 3, which came out a couple months before this. Osomatsu-kun is just not that impressive. Okay, it's 1989. So we're now going to get the Mega Drive caught up with the Famicom and the PC Engine. We'll be covering through June of '89 today. 1989 is a pretty big year for Sega, but we'll have more about that in the next episode of Chronsega. For the moment, let's note that we have a couple firsts here. First third-party developed game, the first third-party published game, and the first port of an existing computer game. With the Master System out of the way, Sega could devote all of its energy on the Mega Drive, at least in Japan. Thus, they have a reasonably healthy release schedule this year with a total of 22 games released. Here are the first 5. Right, so there were no Mega Drive games in January 1989, and then, in the second week of February, Sega returns with a new Alex Kidd game. Finally, Sega gives us a real Alex Kidd sequel, Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle. Hooray! Except for the fact that this game is really not that good. Once again, this is an action platformer with one added feature, jankin, or rock, paper, scissors. And this one has even more jankin than the last one. In fact, in order to obtain any items whatsoever, you need to play jankin. You engage in jankin matches in order to get them. If you lose, you forfeit your money and you don't get anything. So, other than that, what else is new? Well, a few secret areas have been added, like here. You can drop down this to find some hidden treasure. It's like a little vault area complete with Chinese hopping vampires. This part's actually pretty cool. And once again, Sega puts in multiple planes, so there will often be things like columns and whatnot in the foreground. Just like Altered Beast, this game is not too long, only 11 levels, fewer than Alex Kidd Miracle World. There's a speed run that exists. It takes about maybe 6 minutes to get to the final boss. The structure is pretty simple. Reach the end of each level. Killing monsters and opening treasure chests will get you money, just like in Alex Kidd Miracle World. Use that money to go into the shops and engage in jankin matches and hopefully, actually get the item that you're trying to purchase. Now, the first Alex Kidd game was a reasonably fun Super Mario Bros. Inspired game, which was somewhat let down with some weird mechanics like the whole rock, paper, scissors things against the bosses. But still, it was definitely one of the better games on the Master System at that time. But Sega never really followed up on it. Instead, they ported an earlier arcade game to the Master System. That was Alex Kidd The Lost Stars, which really wasn't that much like Miracle World. It was actually a pretty different kind of game. Then they released a really goofy BMX game with Alex on it. And then even worse, they took this terrible adventure game based on an anime character, and in the US changed the sprites and released it as Alex Kidd in High Tech World. And so finally, 2 years later, they produce a full-fledged sequel for their brand spanking new 16-bit system. And it's a bit of a disappointment. For some reason, they took the least loved part of Miracle World, the jankin, and expanded on it. Also, the controls may irritate you a bit, especially Alex's stupid jumping kick. You can't punch in midair, only kick. And the jump has the unfortunate tendency to destroy platforms that you are trying to jump on, since it's hard to be real precise while jumping. On the positive side, the motorcycle and pedocopter are back. Boy, the pedocopter has a really terrible name now that I think about it. That name really implies something else. Some levels have these multiple approaches you can take. They aren't quite like branching paths per se, but you can fly through the air on the copter, or travel by foot, or swim in the lower sections. And there are lots of chests and useful things no matter which way you choose to go. Now, there is one rather strange and notable difference between the US and the Japanese versions. In the US, when playing the jankin matches and you lose, you get like a Monty Python-esque weight dropped on the loser, which even has like these gigantic googly eyes for some reason, and the feet sticking out on the sides. But in the original Japanese game, the loser is stripped naked and then scurries off the stage in a state of embarrassment. Perhaps public humiliation via nudity was more resonant in Japan, or maybe Sega thought it was a bit too racy for a kid's game. One of the bosses is the Egyptian queen, and when she loses her clothes, the results do look a little bit naughty. Sadly for Alex, Enchanted Castle was his last chance to make it big. After this, Sega never made another real Alex Kidd game, though in 1990 they took a Shinobi spin-off game they were developing, which was going to be called Shinobi Kid, and replaced the main character sprite with Alex Kidd. The resulting game, Alex Kidd in Shinobi World, turned out to be better than Enchanted Castle. And thus Alex was banished to the world of failed game mascots. There's just one March release, but it's a big one. Okay, so Phantasy Star II has some pretty great music, and a really cool opening sequence. Now, of all the Mega Drive games covered today, there's really only one that people still speak about with love in their hearts, and that still has a substantial fan base. And of course, it's this game, Phantasy Star II. This makes sense because the first Phantasy Star was certainly the most well-known Master System game, and it was really the only must-have title for that system. Sega must have been planning a sequel for a while, since this came out very early in the Mega Drive's life. It's only the 6th game released, and is far away the biggest and most ambitious of all the early Mega Drive games. Now, as silly as this seems, I'll point out this little segment will have some spoilers, and there are actually a few surprising things in this game, so if you've been putting off playing this for the last 20 years, be warned. The intro gives you a little tour of the surface of Moda, the main planet in the game, and sets up the story. You'll also choose your character's name and get another little intro which starts up with a dream of Alice battling Dark Force, or Dark Fowls as he's also known, the main bad guy from Phantasy Star I. So this takes place many years after the first game, and the desert planet, Matavia, from the original, has all been nicely terraformed. But the weird thing is the weather and environment are controlled by the supercomputer called, I kid you not, Mother Brain. And for some reason, no one knows how Mother Brain works, where it came from, or even where it is. Now, if that sounds really weird to you and maybe a little ominous, like maybe Mother Brain is going to cause some problems later, or maybe even turn evil or something like that, then congratulations, you are skilled on picking up very obviously telegraphed plot points. If you're following the plot here, you'll learn that you are some kind of space cop or special agent or something working for Moda's government, and your boss wants you to find out what's causing the biological monsters to be wandering around all over the place. So he sends you to the Biosystems Lab, which is apparently the likely source of the monsters. Now, Phantasy Star is a science fiction themed RPG, but like many similar JRPGs, the handling of the subject matter is more or less, elves in space. Speaking of which, Ni is your sexy space elf buddy who is half human, half biomonster, and she becomes the first person to join your party. But anyway, this is one of those games where they're like dragons and swords mixed in with robots and laser guns, and people do most of their traveling on foot for some reason. Phantasy Star II is the first 16-bit RPG we've seen, assuming you don't count the TurboGrafx 16 as 16-bit, yet visually it resembles an 8-bit game in a lot of ways. This doesn't really look that different from the first game. Yeah, the sprites are bigger and more detailed, the colors are better, but when compared to like the later 16-bit RPGs, sort of like the 16-bit RPG look that you think of, it's not visually very impressive. Clearly the designers were they didn't stray too far from the look and feel of the first Phantasy Star. In the towns, not much have changed. You have the same shops for items, weapons, and armor. The funny thing is, you would think that like a cutesy little elf girl like Ni would be a magic user and fight with rods or bows and arrows or something, but instead her class of weapons is metal bars. So she kills in the most brutal fashion imaginable, by beating enemies to death with a steel pipe. You would also think that laser guns would be a better choice to go monster hunting with. I mean, which would you choose, a laser gun or a steel pipe? But hey, it's a video game, though in the Japanese version, it appears her weapons were more like claws than bars, like Wolverine-style claws that are worn on the hands. The translation in this game is a little wonky, and of course the weapons are never actually physically depicted in the game. Alright, so let's head out and find that biolab. You know it's a science fiction game because it has corridors everywhere. So here's what the battles look like. You have this futuristic looking grid, both the enemies and your attacks are animated, and this is like sort of the standard issue Dragon Quest style turn-based combat. Though the interface and the way things are controlled are a little bit different, we'll actually discuss that a bit later. After winning the battle you get experience and money just like every other RPG, and then you find a guy named Darum blocking the path towards the west. So you have to head east and then you'll find the first dungeon in the second town. However, before you go to the dungeon, you should actually head back to your house, and suddenly someone shows up at your door. It's the bizarrely named Rudolf Steiner, or Rudo. Now, Rudolf Steiner was like a late 19th century, early 20th century American who was a major figure in a couple of the many sort of mystical, new agey belief systems that popped up around that time. And he's also known for his connection to the Waldorf schools. In the game, he's a monster-killing, laser cannon-toting badass, which makes more sense in the original Japanese version where his name is Rudger. As you can see, he looks a bit like the actor Rutger Hauer. This is how all the party members are found. You're out exploring, you'll hit some sort of invisible trigger, and the next time you return to your house, blam, someone shows up and announces they want to join your party. You also manage your party at your house, so if you want to switch out a party member, head back to your house. So here is the first dungeon. Note the blatantly extraneous use of multiple layers. All the dungeons have these. Your first bit of business is to deal with that douchebag who's blocking your path and terrorizing people. You snoop around the village, find out that quote-unquote scoundrels are hanging out nearby. So you head over to the hideout, this building here, and you find it overrun with biomonsters. It turns out these scoundrels kidnapped the guy's daughter, and he turned to crime to save her life and ransom her or something like that. At the bottom of the dungeon you'll find the daughter and rescue her. Now, late 80s console RPGs are not real good at storytelling or characterization, and this is no exception. Watch what happens when you bring the daughter back. You get this in-game cutscene. The daughter was wearing a veil, so her father didn't recognize her. I love the way the heroes just stand there silently watching while all this goes down. They don't say, "Hey dude, we rescued your daughter," or any attempt to interfere in the fact that he kills her. So now we head towards the computer lab, but first, hey, it's a new party member. This lady is the wimpy character with healing magic, the mage type character, though magic is called techniques in this game. So it's time we had this little talk. People love Phantasy Star II, and you will hear it referred to as one of the best 16-bit RPGs, one of the greatest games ever made, that it redefined console RPGs, that it was years ahead of its time, it introduced all this new stuff into the genre, and that it was a just plain groundbreaking game. In fact, none of that is really true. Now Dr. Sparkle, you say, that's what it says on the internet. The internet wouldn't lie to me. Well, in this case, yeah, the internet does sort of lie. I mean, Phantasy Star II is a fine game in many ways. It was a 6 megabit cartridge, so it was actually the biggest game released on cartridge at this point. It had cool graphics and music, but if you strip away all of that, at its core, Phantasy Star II is really just Dragon Quest II. I mean, here's the basic game structure. You start out in a village, someone tells you to do something, you find some extra party members, enter dungeons, get to the bottom of the dungeon, heal, buy stuff, repeat. At one point you get a vehicle that allows you to travel on water. Near the end of the game, you find like a new area, go through some more dungeons, get the special equipment to fight the final boss. Hell, that's actually the structure of Phantasy Star I. But in some ways, Phantasy Star II is actually kind of a step backwards for the series. Dr. Sparkle, you must be crazy, you say. That's pure nonsense. Well, no, hear me out. Phantasy Star had a lot of wild stuff going on. I wouldn't call it plot, but you might call it sort of like incidents. For example, you recruited a party member by finding a potion to cure him from being turned into stone. You also had like a talking cat for a character. There were a total of 3 planets in Phantasy Star I. There were various environmental hazards on the planet like poisonous swamps, and you entered a prison, and you were captured and had to escape. There was a morgue in which dead bodies were coming back to life. You could talk to dragons. It was full of cool stuff. Phantasy Star II actually has much less content and much less variety of content. Let's take a look at the map of Moto. You see it's actually quite small. That city in the middle, that's the city where you started. In the upper right quadrant, you have the second town and the first dungeon. That's how small the game world is. In the lower right quadrant, the only thing there is one town. And this map isn't just one small area of the game. Most of the game takes place here. Later you travel on to another planet, Dezo, and there are actually only 2 planets instead of 3 in this game. But Dezo is even emptier than Moto. Yet Phantasy Star II is actually pretty long. I mean, so how can this be if the world is so small? Well, you see how the overworld is divided up into lots of little compartments? These compartments are connected at points by these little walkways. The result is, to go from point A to point B, you often have to walk a long winding path. If you want to head to the compartment east of you, you might have to travel down, then over 2, then up 1, then right 1. It greatly lengthens the travel time around the overworld. And the second world is even emptier and probably a lot harder to navigate. I've often seen Phantasy Star II described as having a character-driven storyline. Again, this is a completely inaccurate statement. I mean, yeah, there's a nice selection of characters, 8 to be precise, 4 guys and 4 girls, and you do get to choose which ones you want in your party. This is one of the few modern touches in the game. But outside of the protagonist, only one has any real personality in the game. And what happens is they pop up outside your house, they give you a short speech, give their name, describe their skill set, and then they function as a silent generic party member for the entire rest of the game. I mean, earlier games like Culture Brain's The Magic of Scheherazade had large casts with individual personalities, and other RPGs like Capcom's Destiny of the Emperor, also from 1989, had many more party members. The only really interesting character here is Sheer, who is not very useful in combat, but if you have her in your party, you will randomly steal things from shops that you enter. Now here's a huge tip here, folks. If you have Sheer enter and exit the big headquarters building, eventually she'll steal the Visiphone, which is a device that lets you save your game anywhere you want. Having this device will save you a massive amount of grief if you play this game. In a lot of ways, the first third or so of the game is the most interesting. Here's the rundown. After that guy blocking the passageway blows himself up, you can then reach the biolab. At the bottom level, you get a disc or something like that. Turns out the problem is a power surge from the Weather Control Center, but nobody knows where that is, because the people running Moto are complete idiots. Then, in one of the villages, you meet a guy who says he needs some special ingredients so he can make some chewing gum that lets you breathe underwater. In another dungeon, you can find a jet scooter so you can travel on water. Then you go to an island off the main continent, climb up this enormous, frustrating maze-like mountain, grab this plant, get the gum, and then you find the underwater weather control area, which is marked by a tiny dot in the middle of the ocean. And then, at the bottom level of this dungeon, which looks exactly like all the other dungeons, the most famous part of the game happens. In fact, it seems like every discussion of Phantasy Star sort of brings this one part up. So at the bottom of the dungeon, you encounter this lady who calls herself Knee First. Apparently your buddy Knee is like the good twin of a clone of the evil Knee First or something like that. Knee First was behind the whole biomonster business. Knee gets mad and fights her, and for some reason the rest of the party just stands there and watches, and Knee dies. Then after having died, she makes a speech about the dangers of biological experiments or something, and then according to the narration box, she apparently dies a second time. Then you fight Knee First. This is, by the way, the first boss fight in the game, and there will not be another boss fight until the end of the game. Now consider like how many boss battles there were in the first Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest III, but Phantasy Star does away with bosses almost entirely. Now I'll give Sega credit, I mean they at least attempted to explain why you can't revive Knee. The cloning center says she's not human, so she can't be brought back to life. Though if she died earlier in the game, she could be revived. I know, it's game logic. But Sega at least acknowledges the contradiction of permanent death in these games. So okay, people play this and they go, oh my god, a major character was killed umpteen years before Final Fantasy VII. Phantasy Star II is years ahead of its time. And I mean, I get it, it's surprising. And sure, other games like Final Fantasy II had already done permanent deaths of party members. Half the cast got slaughtered in that game. Ultima 5 also did this, I believe. So it wasn't entirely new, but still, Knee was a party member from the game's beginning, and you sort of thought of her as like the second main character, so her getting killed is pretty shocking. So congratulations Sega, you did one very creative and interesting thing in this game. You get the Nintendo stamp of approval for that one thing. Now let's move on to the rest of the game, and here's where Phantasy Star II starts falling apart. So far the game moved along at a reasonably brisk pace for a game this old, but you're probably thinking, now boy, things are going to get interesting. But from this point onward, the game becomes a total slog. From here on out, it's basically just a series of nondescript dungeons. So killing Knee First somehow caused the weather system to get all crazy, and the planet is now being flooded. Also, all the biomonsters have vanished and have been replaced by security robots. So your boss tells you to open the dams to release the rising water. This means going through 5 dungeons in a row. The first dungeon is where you find the 4 key cards. You then enter the dams one after the other and use the key cards. The dams are huge maze-like dungeons, and look just like all the other dungeons in the game, right down to the foreground layer of pipes. One dungeon is 4 floors, another is 5 floors. All are very complicated and very hard to find your way around in. There's lots of like moving down a floor, then moving to the other end of that floor, and then going back up to the previous floor. It's really easy to get lost, and this section is really long, and there's really no rewards for the player. There's no boss fights, no cutscenes, no plot development. I mean, there's a few treasure chests, but nothing really special. It's just hours of identical looking dungeon crawling. The game gets really boring, in my opinion, at this point. Now finally you reach the bottom of the last dungeon, or the last dam, and then you get another major plot advancement. These 3 undefeatable robots appear and capture you. So it looks like after all this tedium, finally something cool is going to happen, and I suppose it does very briefly. So you find yourself in space on the satellite, and because you are like bound to these energy chains or something, you can't actually fight, so you have to run from every battle. Now you see that the spaceship is headed for Palm, the main planet from the first game. But look at the planet's names on that little map. What's with the inconsistency, Sega? I guess they had to get shortened due to the space issues in the dialogue boxes. Now the story starts getting a little confusing. You suddenly black out and you have another dream, then wake up and find you were rescued by a space pirate with a very unspace piratey name of Tyler. Now don't worry about this guy, he's only in this one scene and is of no importance whatsoever. So it turns out the satellite hit the planet of Palma and completely destroyed it. I guess this is supposed to be like another big shocking moment in the game, though Palma was not even really mentioned in the game until now. You probably only know about it if you remember it from the first game. So you turn to your hometown, your boss lets you borrow the company's spaceship to get to Dezo. Of course, the original Phantasy Star had a spaceship, but here the ship functions like more like a teleporter than a spaceship. I mean, you can only use it to go back and forth between 2 set points. And again, Phantasy Star II lacks really any sort of cool transportation, unlike the stuff we've seen in Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy or even Phantasy Star I. You don't really have to do anything to get this spaceship, it just appears at this point in the story. Like when you dug up the airship in the first Final Fantasy, you were like, wow, this is amazing, I can now fly anywhere I want to in the world. Here, the spaceship is completely uninteresting. So Dezo is amazingly even emptier than Palm. There's 3 generic-looking villages, a bunch of mostly similar-looking dungeons, and there's 1 NPC that has any real dialogue. That's it. To make matters worse, the overworld is divided into separate parts that are all connected by this underground dungeon. So to get to the villages, you need to exit this dungeon, walk to the village, walk back, re-enter that same dungeon, find a different exit, walk to the second village, and so on. Now once you've found all 3 towns, you can just teleport between them, but this whole world layout seems like it's sort of like another attempt to pad the game. You were given vague instructions to find some guy on Dezo. Eventually you'll find this weird temple thing, and it turns out that Lutz, aka Noah, the guy from the first game, is in suspended animation. And he tells you that you're related to Alice, and just like her, you need to save the world. Okay, so you're the chosen one, great. But then there's this. Lutz says you need to find the knee equipment. Wait a second, knee equipment? Is that some sort of connection to knee? Well, the game never actually says. Of course, a lot of RPGs make you find the armor of the ancient hero or something before you can fight the final boss, but here the knee equipment is never explained. In fact, after she dies, knee is never mentioned again, nor is knee first, so I don't know what knee first's importance to the plot actually was. Yet the game brings up the knee equipment and gives you no explanation as to what it is, what it's for, why you really need it, or why it's named after knee. Overall, this seems like a really huge and bizarre plot hole. And guess what? The equipment is scattered through 4 incredibly huge and complicated dungeons. One is 16 floors deep. In some ways, Phantasy Star II is almost kind of like a throwback to older RPGs like Wizardry, where mapping and navigating dungeons is the primary focus of the game. This end part of the game is also kind of a throwback to the first half of the game where you had to go through those 4 dams. It's basically the 4 dams revised, only with a layer of fog covering everything instead of pipes. So real quick, I'll talk about the battle mechanics. It's essentially Dragon Quest II with an added feature of an auto-fighting capability. Actually, auto battle is on by default. You just hit the button to fight and everyone will start attacking monsters randomly. Just like Dragon Quest games, you can't target a particular monster in a group, and you can't really focus on taking out monsters one at a time. So there's very little tactics or strategy involved in battling this thing. And for characters who dual-wield weapons, they will often attack one monster on their first hit and then a different monster on the second hit. Most of the time you just hit the fight button and the battle plays out by itself, and you can get up and grab a soda or something. But if you want to issue commands, you hit the strategy button and then you can have a character defend or use an item or a magic spell. There are quite a few spells. Some are defensive, like healing or increasing defense. Most are offensive, like fire or wind spells. The problem is the names make even less sense than in most RPGs, with names like Sak, Sashu, Zan, Narez, and so on. You're going to need to read the manual to remember what most of the less frequently used spells actually do. I don't think there are any sort of elemental affinities in this game. Swords are very effective against bio monsters, but robots are relatively strong when it comes to swords, but weak against laser blasters. But all the different magic spells seem pretty much interchangeable to me. Against most enemies, magic is really not that useful. It's more useful in the boss fights, but there's only 3 of those in the entire game. But mostly you just hit the fight button and sort of keep an eye on the character's health, and if someone's health starts dropping, then stop and then use magic to heal. The main character and Kane both have quite a few magic spells, but the really powerful magic spells use so many magic points you can't use them very often, and it seems like the character's spells often do, like the cheaper ones, the ones you can actually use on a regular basis, often do less damage than your regular attack, so there's often not much point. Magic other than healing doesn't really play a huge part in this game. Monsters themselves have very few special capabilities other than basic attacks. There's really not much along lines of status ailments. Just like the first Phantasy Star game, the combat is very simple compared to something like Final Fantasy. Still, the monsters are pretty cool looking and everything's nicely animated. Okay, so once you scour the dungeon and pick up all 8 pieces of the knee equipment, you head on back to Lutz, and he'll say "great job guys" and give you a very vague history lesson that basically says, hey, Mother Brain is maybe not so great, I think there's something fishy going on, but I don't really know what. Then he gives you the knee sword and teleports you to a spaceship, which looks more or less like all the other dungeons on Moto. Even the walls look like they're made out of stone. You walk around until you find a treasure chest, and then it's Dark Fowls. Now, I don't know why Dark Fowls is in a box, but hey, it's the game's second boss battle, so be grateful. Now, Dark Fowls, or Dark Force, looks completely cool. He's one of the best looking bosses we've seen in a video game, but this boss also cheats like crazy. You see, every turn he has the option to turn one of the party members evil. This means that the party member is like completely out of commission. They won't attack or obey commands, and unfortunately he can do this 4 times in a row if he wants, turning every single party member evil, and thus you can only watch helplessly as he kills the entire party. As far as I could tell, there's no defense against this. It works 100% of the time and you can't cure it, unless the knee sword decides to randomly flash and cure everyone. But that happens, as I mentioned, completely randomly and somewhat rarely, so expect to get killed a few times while fighting Dark Force. If you're really lucky, instead of just starting to turn you evil right off the bat, he'll actually just start attacking you, and this will give you an opportunity to cast a certain spell that will reduce magic damage. Then you can have your main character cast Megid, the most powerful spell in the game. This does substantial damage. It's the only really hard-hitting magic spell in the game, but has the unfortunate side effect of damaging your party members as well. So ideally you can squeeze out a Megid or 2 before your MP runs out, while using Amy to heal, or using the very rare Star Mist items, which heal all the party members but can't be purchased in shops. But this boss battle is mostly a matter of luck. It just depends on how many party members Dark Force decides to turn evil, and if he does, whether or not the knee sword decides to cure everybody. So you've defeated Dark Force, and then, absolutely nothing happens. At this point you should probably return to Lutz and heal. By the way, Lutz was also called Noah in the first game, and this spaceship is also called Noah, so just like the knee equipment, this is not really explained. So you heal, go through the final dungeon again, and then you'll find the third and last boss, which is naturally Mother Brain herself. Now, I don't know how you fight a computer other than smashing it, but this particular computer looks like a glowing chick with wild hair. Unlike Dark Force, Mother Brain has no special abilities, so you can just pound her to death while healing with Amy. She's really quite fair and very easy compared to Dark Force. By the way, neither boss has any visible hit points, nor displays any damage, so you really have no idea how the battle is progressing, or whether the attacks are even working. So you've destroyed the computer system that controlled the weather, which all your fellow citizens and your civilization sort of relied on. It's not really made clear why you did this, other than Mother Brain was evil. Was Mother Brain the one behind sending the satellite crashing to Palma? I really have no idea. The game doesn't exactly say at this point. And then you get the surprise ending. It turns out the bad guys are Earthlings. After Earth was destroyed, a bunch of survivors headed to Algo, decided to sort of take the solar system over, and they built Mother Brain, and then waited for hundreds of years and then destroyed Palm. Okay, so their plan doesn't really make any sense, but they suddenly attack the heroes, and it's game over. One of the ways that Phantasy Star II does stand out among contemporary RPGs is this odd, ambiguous ending, in which you get these sort of freeze frames and quotes from all the characters as they prepare to battle the Earthlings. And it's not clear whether our heroes are doomed and hopelessly outgunned and outnumbered, and this is like a Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid style ending, where they decide to go out in a blaze of glory, and the last thing we see is their final act of defiance before death. Or maybe the implication is that they're a group of heavily armed seasoned warriors taking on a bunch of old dudes in bathrobes. Maybe you completely slaughter the Earthlings. As it is, the US version is unclear. Paul McLean, writing in a recent article for GameSpot, thought the ending was surprising because it strongly implied that your entire party was killed at the end. On the other hand, Zinnick Reverie of RPG Consular took this ending to mean that you slaughtered the final remnants of Earth's population. So it's really not clear. I guess you could take it either way. Except that the Japanese ending is less mysterious. The ending text there clearly states that you triumphed over the Earthlings, but no one knows what happened to the heroes after that. To sum it up, for a game as highly praised as Phantasy Star II is, it's pretty disappointing. On the plus side, the graphics were beautiful compared to earlier 8-bit RPGs. Enemies were cool looking. The music by Tokuhyu Uwabo, often called just Bo in game credits, is downright excellent. The best music by far in the early days of the Mega Drive. It also has pretty good use of cutscenes, and as is often mentioned, the plot, what there is of it, doesn't reveal itself immediately. It doesn't start out saying, Mother Brain is evil, destroy it. Instead we have, oh, there's something wrong, go check out the computer, and then it kind of goes on from there. And most famously, there is the rather shocking death of Ni partway through the game. However, I'd say the negative elements do outweigh the positive. Compared to competing titles like Dragon Quest III or Final Fantasy II, this is just so simplified and almost empty. Battles are very simple, repetitive, and mostly just involve watching your characters attacking over and over again, while occasionally jumping in and using a healing spell. The overworld is small and not that interesting. The plot doesn't really make much sense. There's pretty much no characterization. Everyone is completely silent for the entire game. But the bottom line, Phantasy Star just seems sort of empty. Compare this to, again, similar games like Dragon Quest III. There were so many little side stories and things to do. There was the Ghost Village, there was the king who wanted Pepper to get a ship, demons impersonating kings, you could create your own town and watch it grow, you could switch jobs with the king, there was gambling, there was like that ghost ship you had to find. There were those hidden treasure chests that you had to find the keys to. There was just so much stuff to do. And Final Fantasy II had all these secondary characters and all these plot twists. In that game you had NPCs who would join your party and then leave and get killed. You had to board an enemy ship to rescue the queen. A tornado came along, destroyed a bunch of towns you had previously visited. You obtained an airship, there were chocobos, you got swallowed up by a giant sea creature, and there were people living inside. There were all these NPCs and subplots. Phantasy Star II has pretty much none of that. Remember the part in the beginning where the guy's daughter was kidnapped and he had to rescue her? That is literally the only sort of side story in the entire game. After that, it's strictly find a dungeon, get to the bottom, then leave, then go into the next dungeon, and so on and so forth. There are 4 dungeons in a row where the object is simply to walk to the bottom, insert a key card in the computer on the bottom floor. The whole thing is so basic and repetitive. Aside from the 16-bit graphics and the sound, this seems in many ways to be a huge step backwards in comparison to some of the better Famicom RPGs. So why did this blow everyone's mind back then? Remember, Sega released this thing pretty quickly on the Genesis. It came out in early 1990, only a few months after the US release of the first Dragon Warrior game on the Nintendo Entertainment System, and a few months before the US release of Final Fantasy I. So US gamers had hardly seen any console-era RPGs to compare this to. No wonder it seemed so groundbreaking. Now I know there's people out there who will violently disagree with me on this, and that's fine, I'm okay with that. Feel free to voice your displeasure in the comments, but there's probably not much you could say that will actually change my mind on this game. Well, naturally, no new console can go on very long without a baseball game, and here's the first one out of the gate for the Mega Drive. Super League, one of 2 games released in April, both with Super in the title. Yeah, before we had Super Mario World and all those other Super games for Nintendo's next system, Mega Drive games were often affixing the word onto their titles. There was Super Thunderblade, Super League, and Super Daisenryaku this episode, and there will be about 3 more next time. Super League uses no licenses whatsoever from any real sports organizations or individuals, and therefore all the teams have really goofy names. These names are based on real Nippon Professional Baseball League teams, like the Chunichi Dragons or the Yomiuri Giants, but they just have one letter out of place. Truthfully, I'm getting pretty numbed to all the baseball and golf games I've had to endure on the Famicom, the Master System, and the PC Engine, so I can't get too excited about Super League. But I'll admit, this is a pretty slick game. The graphics are the best we've seen on just about any baseball game so far, the perspective is pretty well done here, and the catcher is transparent so you can see right through him. The music sounds good too, though a little weird. Doesn't really sound like baseball music. And the speech is pretty darn lifelike. Much better than what we've been hearing on a lot of Famicom sports games. Naturally, Sega released this in the West. In Europe, it was still titled Super League, but for the US, the title was changed to Tommy Lasorda Baseball. Now, Lasorda was a hot commodity at this moment. As the manager of the LA Dodgers, he led that team to win the World Series in 1988. His face dominates the Genesis box art, though nowadays we might think he looks a little like Bill Clinton in this illustration. By the way, you'll notice that Sega continued to use the grid pattern in the box art for the Genesis, sort of like they did with the Master System. Eventually they would go with the red bar running along the left-hand side as their distinctive box cover element. The whole celebrity endorsement thing seemed to be the crux of Sega's strategy for sports games in the US. They all had a similar cover style, and they had names like James Buster Douglas's Knockout Boxing. Sega had also done this on the Master System. You might remember Reggie Jackson Baseball. Just like a lot of celebrity sports games, all Sega did was throw Lasorda on the box art on the title screen. The game itself is the same as Super League. It works pretty smoothly. It's not really that different than all the other baseball games we've seen. Some people don't like the overhead perspective, but it wasn't too uncommon back then. So anyway, now that we've got a baseball game on the Mega Drive, I suspect we'll be seeing a golf game very soon.
Strike! Strike! Out!
Pretty impressive title screen here. Super Daisenryaku from System Soft. This is the first Mega Drive release which is not a Sega original game, though Sega did actually publish Super Daisenryaku. Also, while we tend to think of the era as being one of console game exclusives due to Nintendo's strict licensing rules, Daisenryaku was one of the handful of series that didn't own allegiance to any particular console. The games appeared on computers, Nintendo consoles, Sega consoles, on the PC Engine. It was sort of like Falcom's Ease in that sense. For those of you with bad memories, Daisenryaku was, as far as I know, the series that kicked off the whole military simulation game craze in Japan. It first appeared on computers in 1985. A Famicom port came out in 1988, and we covered that in Nintendo episode 35. Super Daisenryaku was a sequel/upgrade to the first game. It once again appeared on computers in 1989, as well as on the Mega Drive, which we are seeing here, of course, and then later on the PC Engine. Now, just to sort of put things in perspective time-wise, Super Daisenryaku came out on the Mega Drive only 6 months after the Famicom version. I think we all know what this game is about. You move around on the map, fight enemy units, capture cities. You have the same different types of terrain as these games always have. It's really not that different than Famicom Wars. When two units collide, you get these little animated battles, it seems, just like Famicom Wars or Military Madness. So I think that Super Daisenryaku is aimed at an older audience. There is quite a bit of kanji, made possible by the Mega Drive's high-resolution graphics. And it also seems somewhat aimed at military geeks. All the units are real, and I assume are somewhat based on the capabilities of their real-life counterparts. But unless you know what all this crap is, it might not really be clear to you whether sending, for example, an M901 against an M1A1 is a good idea or not. Luckily, there's lots of stats listed, but the game is going to be a bit rough going for non-Japanese speakers or people who don't know a lot about military hardware. So how does this rate against similar games? Well, you know my feelings about Military Madness. So how does this compare to the Famicom Daisenryaku game? Well, it's certainly nicer looking, but more importantly, the map is divided into actual hexagons instead of squares. The Famicom kind of had to compromise in that department. Other than that, it doesn't really seem any different than all the other 8-bit strategy games we've been seeing. There was some exclusive content here. There were maps and units based on stuff from Sega games, but it really doesn't seem to have much of a following in Japan today as far as I can tell. Oh lord, what a way to close out the first half of this episode. Thunder Force II. Now the odd thing about Thunder Force II is that this is the first third-party Mega Drive game. It was published and probably developed by Technosoft, though in the US it was published by Sega. I have no idea what he is saying, other than good luck. So Thunder Force 2 is a shoot-'em-up, though a very unusual one. It has this crazy top-down scheme, where you can move your ship around in all 4 cardinal directions and the 4 diagonal directions. Well, this is the first part of the game. The object is to destroy each of those little bases by shooting out the middle, I don't know what you call it, turret? Port? Something like that. After you do this, you're rewarded with a couple power-ups, meaning new weapons. You see them up there in the top left corner. And, well, there's also that. Your movement is constrained by these moving walls. You need to move around looking for the place where you can break through to find the next little base. Okay, this is it here. Now obviously you're thinking, where is Thunder Force 1? Unless you're a fan of old Japanese computers, you've probably never seen the first Thunder Force game. It was from 1983 on the frickin' Sharp X1 computer, a real antique. Later it received releases on more well-known computers like the PC-88 and 98. It's very clearly inspired by Xevious, and really not that exciting. Thunder Force 2 began on the Sharp 868000 computer in 1988. It introduced horizontal scrolling elements into the game, and was quite a bit more interesting than the first one. To Technosoft, the creators of the Thunder Force games, released quite a few computer games back then. They eventually moved on to consoles. Other than Thunder Force, probably the most well-known is the Herzog series. We'll be seeing Herzog Spy for Chronsega before too long. Now, I don't really like Thunder Force 2, in fact, I sort of detest it. Really, it's these top-down sections that are so annoying to me. You have to wander around all over the planet's surface looking for these little bases, while enemies constantly spawn out of thin air. And all around you, enemy shots are just sort of floating around in the air. In most shooters, once a shot passes your ship, you don't have to worry about it. Here, projectiles can sort of tag along behind you, or right next to you. They all move at the same speed as your ship. So once you destroy the requisite number of bases, you move on to a horizontal section. Now I suppose you are supposed to have entered into some sort of underground base below the planet's surface. These parts are a bit more palatable and act like a much lamer version of Gradius or R-Type. Now here you're constantly picking up new weapons, some of which are pretty darn cool. The game uses multiplane scrolling, which looks nice, but there's really nothing too impressive going on here visually from what I've seen. The later bosses are bigger and badder looking. This guy is clearly Gradius inspired though. Once you defeat the boss, you then head to a new top-down area, then a horizontal area, and so on. The game ends on a top-down area, which is kind of disappointing. Thunder Force 2 does have a few things going for it. Other than R-Type on the PC Engine, it's probably about the best looking shoot 'em up we've seen for a console so far. The music is pretty darn good, the weapons are cool, sorta like those in a compile game. Yet something about the game just makes me hate it. I guess it's those awful top-down sections. Though the horizontal sections do have their moments, like these parts where you speed up really fast and go through these narrow gaps. The game does this more than once. And also, the name is sort of confusingly similar to Thunderblade. Technosoft would actually go on to later release a few sequels. Thunder Force 3 was a bit more traditional and ended up being a much more popular game. This led to an arcade game, a Super Famicom game. Then there was a Thunder Force 4 for the Mega Drive. Both Thunder Force 3 and 4 are a lot better looking than this game. The series had become pretty popular by then, and eventually Thunder Force met a death on the PlayStation 2 with Thunder Force 6. We'll now move on to the second part of this episode, covering the Master System. Though the Mega Drive is not quite caught up with the Master System yet. All of these games are US, European, or Brazilian releases, so we don't really have the exact release dates, but based on information found in some contemporary game magazines, it seems these titles came out in the summer or maybe even early fall of 1989. So let's take a look. We'll start the Master System section off with Casino Games, another gambling simulation game. We see the Vegas Strip, I suppose, with such places as Non, Bow Wow, and Casino. Now, Casino Games is obviously a very classy game, so we were referred to as Mr. or Ms. Sorry, traditionalists, if you're a female, you're stuck with Ms. So I'm Mr. Dr. S here. By account, they mean a password. For a new game, you start off with $500 and hit the tables. There are 4 gambling games: slots, poker, blackjack, and an unusual choice, baccarat. The poker and blackjack work just about exactly as you think they would. You have different opponents of varying skill. The objective is simply to beat your opponents and make a lot of money. There is an ending, apparently, obtainable once you obtain a certain amount of cash. This might remind you a bit of Family Games, aka Parlor Games, which we saw earlier for the same console. Both were developed by Compile, who did a bit of work for the Master System back then. Gabelius and Power Strike being their most well-known titles for the console. Now obviously all these games have poker and blackjack, but the oddball game here is Baccarat. Does anyone actually play this game? I mean, outside of James Bond? And even then, in the new Casino Royale movie, they changed the game from Baccarat to poker. This is not actually the version of Baccarat you think of Bond playing. That's the French version. This is the much more common variation played in most other countries. It's actually 100% luck. The dealer just hands out cards and there's no decision making whatsoever. Despite this, Baccarat is apparently considered sort of a high roller game in most casinos, with big shots gamblers making huge bets on a game of pure chance, kinda like roulette. Casino Games also has a slot machine game, not much to see here. And then here's kind of a strange one, pinball. And this is just for fun, you can't win or lose money. And even though the pinball here isn't really that exciting, it's not exactly Alien Crush or anything like that, the graphics are good and the music is decent. I guess you really can't complain too much about casino games. Wow, so this is unexpected. King's Quest on the Sega Master System? Published by Parker Brothers? I hope you like that music, because this is pretty much the only music in the entire game. It plays out in almost complete silence. Obviously, this has been given a bit of a graphical overhaul from the original, but let's see how faithful it is to the original in spirit when it comes to constantly killing you. Yep, you die when trying to cross the bridge. Roberta Williams would be pleased. So just walking up to the bridge and pressing left will not get you across. You need to use the up button to make sure your feet are actually touching the bridge at all times, because the bridge has an arch to it. King's Quest has a rather problematic implementation of a three-dimensional world onto a two-dimensional format, and this can make certain parts a little difficult. Now this is of course the very first graphic adventure game from Sierra Online. Hell, this pretty much started the whole graphical adventure genre, period. Originally it came out in 1984 on the IBM PC Junior, though Sierra themselves once gave the date as being 1983. King's Quest was ported to other systems and became an enormously popular and important game. And for more info and historical context, I would actually check out the History of Adventure Games section in Crontendo episode 31. I love this part. You look at the king and you see, quote-unquote, nothing special. Ooh, ice burn. I assume that this was unintentional humor. Whenever you're looking at something that can't be picked up or interacted with or moved or something like that, or isn't a quest item, it'll tell you that you're looking at nothing special. The object of the game is to find some magical doohickeys that went missing or something. Fantasy land kingdoms always have to have some sort of magical doohickey. And you go about your quest by walking around, looking under rocks, up trees, picking up various objects of no obvious use. At least, they don't seem to have much use when you first find them. You need to watch out, not only for obvious enemies, but also like holes or any sorts of bodies of water, that sort of thing, because you die very easily. And you will need to use the various objects that you pick up in order to sort of overcome certain obstacles or solve certain puzzles, usually in very non-obvious fashions. You also struggle against King's Quest's very weird, fussy logic. Like here, you're stuck in the well and can't move. This looks bad, right? Are you going to drown? What do you do? Well, you can't do anything until you go to the menu and use the swim command. Yes, you have to specifically issue a command to swim when you're in the water. Okay, so here's a dragon guarding something. He's not that dangerous, and you're supposed to throw a bucket of water at him. But this only works if you fill the bucket with water while swimming around. But the bucket was with you in the water. I mean, you were carrying the bucket, right? So wouldn't the bucket get filled up by itself since it's underwater? I mean, were you carrying the bucket in some sort of waterproof bag or something? These are the kind of like weird logical things that these Sierra games have that can sometimes make the puzzles a bit difficult to figure out. Far and away the worst in King's Quest was the guessing the name of Rumpelstiltskin, but that's obviously something we're not going to cover here. One thing that does make this easier than the old version was that it's ditched the computer version's text parser. In the old one, you actually had to type in commands word by word, letter by letter. Here, all the possible commands are already in a menu, so it kind of resembles like Maniac Mansion a bit. And of course, the question is, did the Master System really need a port of a 5-year-old computer game? I mean, there were already 4 King's Quest games out by the time this came out, and the 5th would appear in 1990. It does seem sort of like an odd choice by Parker Brothers at first, but when you think about it, their other 2 Master System games were Carmen Sandiego and Montezuma's Revenge. Those were both ports of older computer games. King's Quest was the last Parker Brothers game for the system, and the last third-party published game in the United States. Though aside from the 3 Parker Brothers games, we only had 2 Activision games, so clearly third-party games were not one of the Master System strengths in the US. Mid-1989 was sort of a weird time for the Master System. It was dead in Japan, though Sega was still developing and releasing games for the US and European market on a pretty sporadic basis. Here's one oddball game that supposedly came out in Europe only, Outrun 3D. I'm not 100% sure about that. It was definitely being sold in the US, as seen in magazine advertisements at the time. I suppose it could have been imported. Documentation of the Master System releases were pretty sketchy back then. Anyway, this is more or less a 3D remake of Outrun. The Master System Outrun came out back in spring of 1987 and was covered in Chronsega 3. Like most other 3D Master System games, you can choose either 3D or 2D visuals. So you'd think that if you turned off the 3D visuals, you would just be basically playing the old Master System Outrun, right? Well, interestingly, no. Sega reworked the whole thing. There were new music tracks added, and there are a few stages that have been altered a bit. But the sad thing is, this is actually worse than the first Master System Outrun game. Let's compare. Here's the 1987 game. It looks more or less the same, but feels much faster, and the controls somehow work a little better. I don't really understand what happened. I mean, the old Outrun was not fantastic, but this one is much worse. Maybe it has something to do with the 3D conversion? I'm not sure. Here's one of the areas that was added on to Outrun 3D. It looks cool, I'll give it that, but look at this though as we exit the tunnel. Ouch, that was ugly. And what just happened to the sky here? It's a bit of a shame. I mean, I love the arcade Outrun, but we just can't seem to get a decent version on the Master System. This one looks okay, but the whole thing just feels sluggish and hard to control. Not really sure what happened, but oh well. Here's an odd one, just the way we like them. Basketball Nightmare, another game supposedly released only in Europe, which is odd since basketball is more popular in the US, right? There's a few different modes here. Versus play works just like any other low-grade basketball game. Each player chooses a country, then it's a head-to-head play between the 2 players. But the interesting part is perhaps the single-player version. You see, this is a horror-themed basketball game. Each level has you facing off against a team of monsters. First up is the Lavender Werewolves. Now I guess on the surface this seems pretty cool, but there are some problems. The gameplay is pretty basic. You just take the ball, run to the other team's basket, and then shoot. 90% of the time it goes in, often with a pretty cool animated cutscene of a player making a really cool and physically impossible slam dunk. Alright then, so what's the problem? Well, first of all, the gameplay is very basic. There seems to be virtually no stealing the ball, blocking shots, or anything like that. There are fouls, though it's not really clear how you foul someone. You can move your player right on top of the guy with the ball, and most of the time, nothing happens. Every so often you will get a foul called for no apparent reason. You can pass the ball, you can switch between players, and that's about it. But mostly what happens is you get the ball, score a basket, the other team takes the ball, scores a basket, the ball goes back to you, etc. Every once in a while someone will miss a basket, or occasionally it'll be like an interception, but mostly you just seem to take turns shooting baskets. So the object here is simply to defeat the opposing team, move on to the next level, and face another team of monsters. So the second level has kappas. How can kappas even play basketball? They can't even tilt their head too much or the water will fall out of the hole in their head. Yet here they are doing all kinds of crazy jumps. Now, truth be told, there is sort of a game-breaking bug here that allows you to always win against the CPU. If you shoot a three-pointer from the corner near your basket, it will almost always go in. Thus, you can net 3 points every turnover to the CPU's 2 points. Now, so many things about Basketball Nightmare screams quickie shovelware, like the incredibly repetitive music. If it weren't for the somewhat unusual subject matter and the cool slam dunk animated scenes, I'd say this would be of very little interest. Okay, so the Sega Master System may be in its twilight years in 1989, but that doesn't mean it can't have awesome games. And here is the proof. Wonder Boy 3: The Dragon's Trap, the sequel to Wonder Boy and Monsterland, which we saw not that long ago in Chronsega 5. However, for this video we are technically playing Monster World 2, the Japanese version, since it has better music. The thing is, Monster World 2 was never actually released in Japan. Rather, both versions are on the same cartridge, which auto-detects the region of the console and plays the correct version. This was obviously a cost-saving measure and seems to indicate that Monster World 2 was scheduled for a Japanese release. The Master System was discontinued over there before it could come out. When anyone talks about this game, they always bring up the opening sequence and its similarity to Castlevania Symphony of the Night. At the end of Wonder Boy and Monsterland, you have to go through this enormous castle and fight the final boss, a robot dragon. This game actually starts in that final level, with Wonder Boy fully leveled up. You can see that he has a full health bar by looking at those hearts up there. Also, his stats are super high and he has the best equipment. After going through a super short version of the robot dragon's castle, you replay the final boss battle of Monsterland, more or less. Obviously, this is very similar to the start of Symphony of the Night, where you begin as Belmont, replaying the final battle of Rondo of Blood. One thing I don't like about this game is the controls during the boss battles. Every boss requires you to jump and strike him on the nose with your sword. But the required timing is really strange. You need to hit the attack button almost immediately after jumping, as opposed to doing so near the top of your jump. If your timing is off, you'll just slam into the dragon's face. The required timing just feels really weird. You have to get into the correct rhythm to hit the boss every time, but if you miss once, it sort of breaks the pattern and kind of screws you up. It's really sort of hard to explain. Now you're supposed to avoid the blue flame and collect those coins, which I failed to do. Eventually the blue flame will hit you, and then you have sprung the dragon's trap. You've been turned into a dragon. The next step is to escape the castle, which is obviously going to blow up. Or rather, it collapses. Either way, it's definitely a Konami-style destruction of the bad guy's base. Now the game really begins. Okay, so you lost all your cool equipment and you're powered down to crappy stats and have now 1 heart. The village, apparently Wonder Boy's hometown, will function as the hub of the game world. All the other levels sort of branch out from here. Of course, in the classic Metroid style, all but one of those areas is inaccessible to you at this point. The village has a locked door, a large obstruction, and so on, though there is an equipment shop and a sexy nurse who will heal you. If you look around, you'll find that the only way you can go is down this well. Now, this is kind of like some of the later Castlevania games. You can travel through the waterway, but there are visible paths that you cannot reach. Later, of course, you'll obtain abilities that will allow you to get up into those places. Once you get out on the surface, you'll see the typical Wonder Boy style platforms and palm trees, along with old enemies like snakes and sand crabs. But you will also need to travel along the ocean's floor at some point. Yeah, falling in the water doesn't equal instant death, it just takes you to the ocean level. The final goal of this ocean crossing is a chest with a key that can be used to open the locked door back in the village. Now, those of you familiar with the Wonder Boy series will know there is another game called Wonder Boy 3, completely different than this one. That game, Wonder Boy 3 Monster Lair, was released in arcades in 1989. Let's do a quick refresher on the insanely convoluted history of Wonder Boy. Now, the first game, Wonder Boy, was an arcade title developed by Westone and manufactured by Sega. It was ported to the Master System by Sega, and Hudson bought the rights, changed the character sprites, and released it for the Famicom as Takahashi Meijin no Bokenjima, or Adventure Island in the US. Hudson later made more Adventure Island games, but these are original games that are not based on Wonder Boy games. The sequel, Wonder Boy in Monsterland, started in arcades, again was ported to the Master System, but was called Super Wonder Boy Monster World in Japan, and that's why this game is called Monster World 2 in the Japanese version. Wonder Boy in Monsterland was once again licensed by Hudson from Westone and released as one of the very first PC Engine games, but with the characters again changed, this time to use the Bakuri Man characters. The arcade Wonder Boy 3 was eventually ported to the Mega Drive and was licensed by Hudson, who rather uncharacteristically kept the Wonder Boy name when they put it out on the PC Engine. They then came to their senses, however, when releasing it for the US and called the TurboGrafx 16 version just Monster Lair. The game we are watching today is a Master System original. It's not based on any arcade game. Sega did eventually release it for the Game Gear under the name Monster World 2. Hudson, making up for the fact that they forgot to change the character's name in Wonder Boy 3 Monster Lair, released it as Dragon's Curse on the TurboGrafx 16, and, in one of the weirdest decisions ever, it was released in Japan on the PC Engine as Adventure Island, despite the fact that they already had another game series in the US with that same title. After this, things sort of settled down. The next game was also a console original, Wonder Boy 5 Monster World 3, debuted on the Mega Drive and hit the Genesis as Monster Boy in Monster World, doing the whole Mario Land, Mario World thing. Hudson called it Dynastic Hero when they did the PC Engine version, and yes, Sega also released it in Europe on the Master System. The final game in the series was a Japanese-only Mega Drive release called Monster World 4. So why did Hudson normally change the Wonder Boy character to something else? I always heard that Sega owned the rights to the character, Wonder Boy, and Westone owned the games themselves. Thus, Hudson couldn't use the character. However, in a recent interview with the designer of most of the Wonder Boy games, Ryuichi Nishizawa, on Hardcore Gaming 101, it was revealed that Westone did own the copyright to the Wonder Boy character, and Sega only had a trademark for the name Wonder Boy. So Hudson didn't really have to keep changing the character sprites. Who knows why they did? So now you can sort of see the structure of the game. From the tower, accessed by the locked door, you can now enter a new area. Finishing off this area allows you to access a new area, and so on. Some areas have a boss dragon, others just have a key or some kind of item. Either way, whenever you fight a dragon or get an item, you get some new abilities. Once you beat the boss, you begin to become cursed and transform into another form. Defeating the second boss turns you into Mouse Man. And he has actually a pretty cool ability, the ability to walk up certain walls, those ones with the checkerboard patterns. The Mouse Man level actually makes pretty good use of the boss's castle. You need to climb along walls and ceilings to avoid enemies, as well as balls of flame shot by these rather Castlevania-like stone heads. Mouse Man is also smaller than the other forms, so he can fit into narrow passages. This boss here is a zombie dragon. Not that difficult, but as I mentioned earlier, it's all about the timing. You now transform into Piranha Man, who has the ability to swim in water as opposed to just walking along the floors of the underwater areas. Throughout the game, you kill monsters and collect coins, which aside from spending at the hospital, you use to buy equipment, namely better swords, shields, and armor. For example, the dragon armor allows you to walk in lava, so you must buy it to get past this section. Some areas have transformation rooms where you can transform into one of your other forms. In this place right here, you need to transform back into Mouse Man to access a treasure chest containing a magic sword. This allows you to break certain blocks and access new areas. And that's pretty much how the game goes. There's a bit more to it, I suppose. You have like a charisma type stat that you raise by getting certain items or special equipment. And your charisma has to be high enough to buy certain pieces of equipment from shops. You also have limited use special weapons, like for example an arrow for shooting straight up in the air at enemies in the sky, or tornadoes for killing enemies below you. There's also lots of fun stuff like hidden shops. You can go back into older areas and find previously inaccessible areas for life bar extensions, money, items, and so on. The cool thing about this game is that it really rewards you for exploration. It's the exact opposite of Wonder Boy and Monsterland, which you had like a timer that was ticking off the entire time. So after taking down the Samurai Dragon, who is a royal pain, by the way, you turn into your final form, the Hawk, who can pretty much fly anywhere he wants. Now this allows you to access a hidden area, which is actually the Robot Dragon's castle from the game's beginning. Here you can get the best sword in the game, the Legendary Sword, and also the best treasure chest in the entire game is hidden here. If you go back into the room where the sword chest was, it's now full of a massive amount of cash and a full health refill. And this chest resets whenever you save and load your saved game, thus your money problems are pretty much solved. Now we've seen a few Metroidvania type games prior to this, but for me, this is the one that really hits the sweet spot between action, exploration, RPG elements, and just general cool stuff like finding hidden areas and gaining new powers. I'd say it's quite a bit better than, say, Clash at Demon Head or the proto-Metroidvania games like Goonies 2. Now, it's not perfect by any means, but I'd say that it's sort of the fullest instance of the genre so far, and looks forward in many ways to games like Super Metroid and the later Castlevania games. So really, it's a major accomplishment on Sega's part, and it's a real shame its Japanese release never happened. It's considered by many people to be the best game in the Wonder Boy series. The sequel, Wonder Boy and Monster World, ended up being in pretty much the same style. After returning to his home village, no one seems particularly interested to see him, but it does appear that he shacks up with the sexy nurse. I guess that must be his girlfriend. Wonder Boy 3 is not perfect by any means. I didn't much care for the boss fights, and even though the graphics are really nice, in some ways they actually are a step down from the previous game. For example, the boss battles are just set against a pitch black background. When comparing the Robot Dragon fight in this game with that in Monsterland, you'll see they removed the detailed background from the Robot Dragon's room. But overall, it's a huge achievement, and Wonder Boy 3 is practically the Super Mario Bros. 3 of the Sega Master System. Okay, we have one last game today, released sometime in the summer of 1989, Cloudmaster. Again, this was probably designed with Japan in mind because they didn't even bother to create an English title logo for it. Cloudmaster, or Chukataisen, is a barely remembered horizontal shoot-'em-up with a Chinese mythological theme. As you can see, the backgrounds look sort of like a traditional Chinese painting style, in the CAE landscape style. Your character sort of resembles Sun Wukong, the Monkey King from Journey to the West, and all the enemies are Chinese inspired. Some are simple things like bowls of rice or soup or something, or turtles. Actually, some of the enemies are pretty lame. Aside from your standard pea shooter, you can obtain special weapons. This is done by defeating like a mid-level boss, the two of which typically appear on each level. When you kill these guys, a magical door appears and you get to pick one special weapon. Every time you do this, it replaces your current special weapon, so choose carefully. You can only have one special weapon at a time. There's functions like bombs, diagonal shots, that sort of thing. You can also find power-ups for your regular weapons. Here is the spread shot, for example. As I mentioned, Chukataisen was originally an arcade game in 1988, developed by Hot B of Black Bass infamy, and published by Taito. The game didn't really look all that bad. I believe that it ran on the New Zealand Story hardware, so the graphics were pretty good looking. Certainly the enemies looked much more interesting on the arcade game. The Sega Master System version looks pretty dull by comparison, as is to be expected. Here is the first boss, a phoenix. He does nothing too unexpected, you just avoid his feathers and shoot him in the face. After defeating him, you get this little cutscene. There are two versions on the same card, the Japanese text version and the one with English text. So this certainly indicates that there was a Japanese release planned, created, put on the cart, and then cancelled when Sega dropped support for the console in the home country, just like Wonder Boy 3. Chukataisen's not a bad game, just a little tired and uninspired. None of the enemies are that exciting. The action is pretty darn repetitive. The backgrounds and settings are really about the only interesting thing. I mean, some of the bosses are pretty big and look good. So overall, it's a pretty typical horizontal shoot-'em-up, nothing too special. Alright, there we go. And now, as is the tradition, I'll proclaim a top game for this episode. And Phantasy Star II fans, you have my apologies, but I'm giving it to Wonder Boy 3, The Dragon's Trap. Even though it's on the humble Master System, this game is just super radical, and absolutely one of the best Master System games ever. As for the worst game, sometimes in Chronsega I have a hard time awarding the worst game designation, simply because, since all the games are built by Sega, we usually see a certain baseline of competence. Still, today I'll say Outrun 3D, since it actually seems worse than the original Outrun on the Master System. But also, I'll say the most disappointing game is Alex Kidd. Sega, for some reason, just could not deliver a really good Alex Kidd sequel, and they basically dropped the ball with that character. As for next time, well, Master System fans will have to be satisfied with a handful of very minor games as we enter fall of '89, but in the Mega Drive department we have two Capcom games, hooray, a classic Sega arcade conversion, and a sequel to one of the most hated Famicom RPGs of all time. See you then.